Hi kids, I'm at I will be at the regional office today, so recording 3.9 video for you, in case you want to hear me lecture. Um, to start off, you do have homework tonight. The homework will be, you don't have to write anything for homework tonight. The U.S. Constitution, it is from the National Constitution Center. They have the whole Constitution from the preamble to the articles to the Bill of Rights on the bottom and our amendments. Basically just read over this entire thing, so it should be take about like half an hour, I think, right? If you half an hour ish. The reason why I chose this site is that they have like these interactive summarizations, not summarization, but annotations in a sense. So it kind of helps you to understand it as they go along, and then to ensure that you read it, when I'm back on Wednesday, we'll have a little 20-minute kind of seminar about the Constitution, just talking about it. Right, I'll ask about a couple questions, and you guys are expected to keep, talking about it, discuss about it, right, kind of thing. So that will be how I'm grading your homework for this one. It's based on the seminar, and obviously, if you talk, show me that you read some stuff, right, have an idea about the Constitution, then I'll just give you a full grade on that. So just to make sure you read the entire thing, right? Obviously, you don't have to like know every single line by detail, but just know the general, right? What are each section talking about, etc. Right? All right. To start off our lesson today, it is 3.9. We're looking at the Constitution today. Probably the most important piece of writing from the entire course that you need to remember basically ins and outs of it. We're going to look at, right, what are some of the continuities and the changes that the Constitution brought, right, in comparison to the Articles of Confederation, right, and its structure and its function, right, within the government. So 3.9, start off, we're going to look at some of the continuities it had from Articles of Confederation, which we looked at last Friday. First, it keeps state sovereignty. Basically, they said state. Let me make sure I'm recording. Yeah. They said that state, right, retained significant power, such as local governance and education, right. And this is continued today, right. The state government is still not affiliated with the federal government even today, and each state has their own education system, right. So this is still retained today, right. These kind of state power retained, right, the revolutionary ideas and their distrust, their PTSD from a very centralized authority, right, from PTSD from the British ruling. And also Republican ideal, right? Both Articles of Federation and the Constitution is rooted in the idea of the consent of the government, right? The government is made up by the consensus of the people, right? The people who are being governed. So this draw on Enlightenment principles from Locke and Montesquieu and Thomas Paine, right? Our philosopher we talked about. Also congressional authority. They still gave the Congress, right, power to wage war, make treaties, borrow money. They didn't change these power, right? The Article of Confederation, these are the couple of only powers they gave the federal government. The Constitution kept these power for congressional authority, right, for our legislative branch, and also the Western lands, right. Continue the framework from the Land Ordinance, right, and the Northwest Ordinance. We learned for territorial expansion, right. The U.S. wants to keep expanding for more resources, right. So these are the things that, right, the Constitution kept from the Article of Confederation. Now, let's look at changes. One of the main changes was federalism, right? Again, we talked about in class today that federalism was, right, the idea that state and government powers, or federal and state powers, are separate, right? And with federalism comes a lot of changes in the Constitution. First, divided power between state and federal government very, very clearly, right? Very clearly. We'll look at in a bit, right? What are some powers that the federal government have versus what are some of the powers that the state government have. Actually, in fact, let me see if I can pull up my notes from last year that talks about state and federal powers. Is it this one? No, it's the next one, slide 5. I think that will be useful in today's lesson as well. That should be November. This one? Oh god, nope, not this one. 4th? Yeah, this one. Okay. So we'll look at this one as well. Right, we'll look at this one as well. Right after this slide. Yeah. So federal power, right? Actually, I'll just add these slides in here. I'll just add these four slides in here. It's going to be a slightly long slide, right? So we don't need to we can get rid of that. So federalism divided power between the state and the federal government. All right. And then to look at the federal and the state power, we'll look at the couple next slide, right? Because it's more in detail. And long-term effect, right? By today, right? Our federal government accounts for most of our GDP fundings, right? Through like they collect tax, and then the federal government provides infrastructure. Unfortunately, right, most of the funding, right, over half the funding they do put into the military, right? Military is the highest spending, right? If we can probably look like 2024 federal government spending, right? Right, if we look, right, as you can see, oh, agencies, Department of, this is not the correct chart I'm trying to look for. Anyway, regardless of that, I'm not gonna spend too much time finding that right now because we need to go through the lesson. Anyway, so quickly look at what are some of the federal power versus the state power that the Constitution gave, right? So for federal power, right, for the federal government, it's the power is listed in Article 1, Section A when you read the Constitution. So, right, Article 1, Section A, all this entire list is, right, it's listed as federal government power of Congress. So that includes stuff like coin money, so basically making money, borrow money, right, regular state commerce, that's basically, right, imports and exports with other country, establish post office, right, army and navy, power to declare war, make treaty with other nations, grants patents and copyrights, right, naturalization, right, people like, Mr. Wang got our citizenships through nationalization. The Congress decide that. Also inferior courts to the Supreme Court. So we'll learn about that, the judiciary branch. So even though the Supreme Court is judiciary branch, right, the inferior courts is established by Congress actually. So we'll learn about that in a bit. Define and punish piracies, an offense against the laws of nations, right? And then the DC or District of Columbia. In District of Columbia, because Washington DC is not a state, right? It is a district. Basically, all the, right, for most states, right, you have a state senate or a state congress, whatever, for laws passed, right? For DC, it's just the Congress takes over DC, right? And then it's the elastic clause, which basically means Congress can pass any law necessary to pass out its power. I believe that is amendment. Elastic clause comes after the Constitution, but regardless, right, Congress can also pass any laws necessary to carry out its powers. So these are the national powers, right? In the state powers, it's stating Article 5, right? So it didn't really list out, right, like the national government or for the national one, right? Right, the entire list, but basically Article 5 says that states have the power to ratify amendments, and that is a big power that states have, because in order to putting any of these amendments into the Constitution, over 2/3 of the states have to ratify the said amendments for it to be added into the Constitution, right? So over 66%, right? So we have 50 states right now. In order to add any new amendments, about more than 33, so 34 states at least is needed to ratify an amendment, right? And then the 10th Amendment also, right? If we look, so we're on to the 10th Amendment, the power not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. So it's basically saying any power that's not delegated, right, in Article 1, Section 8, right, we looked at, right, that long list of power, that any power that's outside of that list is granted to the states, right, it's reserved to the states, right, that's why it's called reserve powers and OI can use as well, right, because that means, right, federal, not given to federal are reserved for the states or the people, so that's why we don't have a list. However, there's a lot of reserve powers, right, that the state have. For example, ratifying amendments, issuing a license, right, your driver's license, marriage license, right, establish local governments, right, your local county government, city government, right, regulate interstate commerce, right, so commerce was this is, oh, intrastate, all right, intrastate, so this is commerce, right, any trades, right, any business within the state, right, is regulated by the state. Conduct state election, right, I should probably specify that, conduct state elections, establish and oversee public school system, right, public health and safety system, right, so like for your fire or police department, fire department is regulated by the states, right, your local state courts, right, so all courts other than the Supreme Court is established and ran by right, in the states, right, in the state level is established by the state government, right, this is concurrent with the federal government. We'll learn about the branches or how the judiciary branch is broken down a bit, and then also manage public land within and buildings, so any public land, so like your school buildings, your firefighting department, right, buildings, right, your libraries, right, all those kind of stuff are regulated by the state, right. Right, so and then there's some shared powers. I will look at the federal government power, look at the state power. There's some shared powers they have between them, right? Both state and federal government collect taxes, right? In California, right, people who work in 9 to 5 like Mr. Wayne, we have to pay tax for both the state and the federal government, which kind of sucks, but it is what it is, right? State can also borrow money, right? It's not a right the federal government have. State can also establish courts, right? They can both make laws, right? Federal government can make federal laws, state government can make state law and enforce it, right? They can both build and maintain roads, right? That's why we have interstate highways and then state highways, right? So interstate highway, like, you know, like the 5, like the 10, like the 210, right? Those are some of the ones that are near us, right? Like the 705, like 705, right? Those highways are interstate highway, right? The one with the blue, right? Blue signs, right? Those are maintained by and built by the federal government, and then you have your state highways, right? So around us is like, you know, like the 60, like the 101, right? Along the coastline, the highway 1, right? Those highways are maintained by the state, by the California state, right? And both can spend money, obviously, for general welfare, right? Both things can establish bankruptcy law and take private public for public use, right? It is what we call in social studies eminent domain with just constification, right? So I'll just put this up here, right? So this one is in the 5th Amendment, I believe, eminent domain, right? Right. No person shall be held to answer a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless a presentation jury. That's the jury part, right? Right. No, the last part here, right? Or the right. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation, right? So the idea of eminent domain, that the government is taking your public use, right, with the agreement, and they usually compensate you a lot, right? They usually compensate you more than your property is worth. So, yeah. And then the interstate relation and obligation in Article 4 is basically saying that state must respect other states' law and decision, right? So that's just kind of making the states abiding to each other's, right, respecting each other in a sense. And then some other shared powers. State register their own voters and run their own elections, even though if it is a federal election, right, each state like is responsible for running their election, right? Congress just there to set the election dates, and then federal state agency work together when it comes to disaster relief, right? And then there's a supremacy clause in Article 6. If you're looking at Article 6, right, there's a supremacy clause basically saying federal law is the supreme law of the land, and if there's a federal and a state law that is conflicting each other, federal law take precedence, right? So right, basically the Constitution and the law of the U.S. which shall be made persuasive of, and all treaties which shall be under the authority of the U.S. shall be the supreme law of the land, right? Supreme law of the land. So that kind of go over the idea of federal versus state power, right? Federal versus state power. Now look at the Constitution itself. The three branches of government that is set up with. You have your separation of power, right? So our Constitution is built under the idea of separation of power and check and balances, right? That the Article of Confederation did not have, right? The Article of Confederation only had the legislative branch, right? But the Constitution now has three branches, and we replace our legislative branch with a unicameral Congress with three branches, right? The three branches are, right, your legislative branch, that is our Congress today, right? It is bicameral. You have the House, which is population based, right? There's 435 seats in the House in total, and in the Senate, right? 2 per state, up to 50, right? So 2 per state. And the Congress is responsible, right? We'll learn about what Congress is responsible for in the next slide, so I'm not going to go over too much right now. You have the executive branch, basically it's the president and his cabinet, right? The president recommend and enforce laws and also leads federal programs, right? So that's what the cabinets are for, right? The federal programs, right? Like your Department of Defense, or I guess it's called Department of War nowadays, right? Trump renamed it recently. Department of War, you have Department of Education, Department of Social Welfare, right? Department of, I'm trying to think, right? Department of Justice, right? Those the kind of departments are in the executive branch, right? And you have the judiciary branch, which is the Supreme Court, and lower courts that's under it, right? They interpret law, the Constitution, right? They interpret laws in the Constitution and make decisions, right? Make very crucial decisions. So, check and balances is the idea that each of the three branches are keeping each other in check, right? It's the idea that each of the three branches are keeping each other in check. Let me see if I can find my last year's notes on check and balances. Or did I? Let me see if did I add them here. Let me see if I can find my last year thing on check and balances. Did I really not add in check and balances in here? I find that kind of unbelievable though. I guess I did not. Or is it in here? Oh yeah, there it is. I swear I remember. So I'll add the slide in here as well for us. Right, the idea of check and balances. So you can just quickly, basically, right, check and balances is different powers that each of the three branch, right, legislative, executive, and the judiciary branch have to keep the other branch in check, to make sure they're not overstepping their power, not overstepping their boundary, right? To check that none of the branches can become a tyrannical, right? Tyrannical ruler, right? That kind of sense. So, if you look on this following slide, right, these are kind of some of the ways each branch keep the other power or keep the other branches in check, right? For the legislative branch, right, they can override the president's veto on a bill, right? If they really want it to become a law, they just need 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate to do that, right? They can also impeach the president, right? The House can impeach and the president or any federal judge if deemed necessary to do so, right? The House is the House will be the one that's kind of like starts the impeachment process, basically, right? Put them into trial, and the Senate will be the one that vote on it and remove them. And also advise and consent. Basically, the Senate have to approve presidential appointments and treaties, right? So, right, one of the most controversial appointment lately is President Trump's appointment of RFK, right, RF Kennedy as um, right, trying to appoint him into the Department of Health, right? Um, right. So, mm, no, that is not RFK Jr. Sorry, RFK Kennedy Jr. Right. He's currently going through a lot of Senate hearings trying to be appointed. Right. That is the power of the legislative branch. Now the executive branch. So your president, right? Your president has the power to veto. Basically, mean right legislations, bills that are passed, right? That are passed, right? Initially by the House, right? Usually the president has to say yes or no on the said bill, right? After so if the president vetoes it, right? Even though right the Congress still has the power to override the veto, but it requires a very very harsh um, condition, right? And then the executive branch also has executive orders. This means that they can issue executive orders and give government operation without the need for legislative approvals, right? And then you have appointment of power. This basically says the president has the power to nominate judges, ambassadors, and other key officials, right? They can nominate it, but the Senate still need to approve on it, right? The Senate still need to approve on it. So to make sure they don't have too much power. With the judiciary branch, our judiciary branch has the power to judicial review. This was actually added after the Constitution, because we found eventually the founding fathers found that the judiciary branch was a little too weak, so they got the power to judicial review. Basically, it means that they can declare laws passed by Congress. So if the judiciary branch deem any laws passed by the legislative branch unconstitutional, basically unlawful, they can declare declare it unconstitutional and invalidate them, basically get rid of that law, right? And also lifetime tenure, right? Any judges that once they make it into the Supreme Court, they're there for life, right? They're there for life in the Supreme Court, right? After the Senate confirms it. So that's the power of check and balance that each of the three branches have to keep each other in check, all right? So to continue with our Constitution, some other parts, right? Compared to our Articles of Confederation, it does have a stronger central government, right? I gave the Congress the power to tax, right? The power to commerce, right? Regulate power, right? I also created the executive and judiciary branch, which is not in the Articles of Confederation, right? And this enable, right, the government able to pay debt, right? Because we're collecting taxes now, regular trades, right? Have federal law enforcement, right? And resolve articles' weak economic policies, right, and foreign policies. And then the electoral college system was introduced as well, right? I already touched on with you guys what are the electoral college system is. I'm not going to go over too much, right? But basically, right, presidential election to balance with democracy with stability, avoiding mob rule that can possibly confront that direct democracy, right? Instead, we have a representative democracy. And then the Bill of Rights, right, our first 10 amendments, right, was added in 1791. Remember, right, we talked about today, right, this was the compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right, that the Federalists agreed for the Constitution to pass, right, the Bill of Rights to be added, right, and we did add it in 1791, right. It was drafted by James Madison and ratified in 1791. The purpose of it is to protect individual liberties, in which we will look at right now. Actually, let me pull it up because I think we should be able to look at it right now, then into the details, right? So the Bill of Rights includes your first 10 amendments, actually, right? So the first 10 amendments, I put them simplified, right? First Amendment basically, right, prohibits any laws that will prohibits laws from against, right, basically freedom of religion, freedom of speech, right, freedom of exercising speech, press, assembly, and petition, right? Prohibit laws that yeah. So basically, First Amendment did that. Second Amendment protect the rights to bear arms, right? So your gun laws, basically, right? It's your Second Amendment. Third Amendment banned, so this was against the Quartering Act, right? The Third Amendment banned quartering soldiers in homes without any consent during peacetime, right? This is only during peacetime, so, or legal, or if during wartime if needed, it needs to go through a legal process, right? And then Fourth Amendment banned against any unreasonable searches, seizures, right? This require police to have a search warrant, right, with a probable clause or search warrant passed down, right, by a judge in the court to be able to search your house, right? They cannot come into your house if they don't have a search warrant, right? Fifth Amendment, this ensures grand juries, right? Basically, this ensures jury for a crime, right? So even if you're poor and you can afford a lawyer, you, right? Not lawyer, sorry. Even if you're poor, right? Oh, actually, that's Sixth Amendment actually, which sixth and seventh, which we'll get in a bit. But instead, make sure that there's a jury, right, for hearing things. So things like the Boston Massacre doesn't happen, where people of crime are, because there's no jury, they're free of their crimes, right? There's also no double jeopardy. Basically means you cannot trial for the same crime twice, right? You cannot be trialed for the same crime twice, right? So let's say, right, you stole something, I don't know, $100 worth of things, right? You got out of it. Basically, they cannot trial for you that again. Now, however, if you steal another $100 things and then you get caught again, that's different, right? But you cannot be tried for the same crime twice, right? There's also no self-incrimination. That means you cannot basically get yourself right, scare yourself in, right, the act is the act of providing testimony evidence that will expose a person to criminal prosecution, right? So this is basically protected to give you the right to remain silent, right? The right to remain silent, right? Right. It's right. Where is it? Right here, right. So you have the right to remain silent. Where it comes from, the Fifth Amendment, right? Sixth Amendment grants you a speedy public trial, right? Also impartial jury, right to no charges. So like you have the right to remain silent, stuff like that, right? When the police, I hope none of you, ever have to get in that case, but when the police do, catch you, right? Right, they do always say that, right? Right, also confront witnesses, obtain counsels, right? So these are all the rights in the legal court process in which you, as an American citizen, have, right? Seventh Amendment basically preserves jury trial for civil lawsuits over $20, right? And limits re-examination, right? Also, Sixth Amendment grants you the right to a lawyer, right? If needed, if you can afford one, the government will provide you with one. Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bails, fines, and cruel unusual punishment in jails, right? So basically, your bail cannot be over certain amounts, your fines cannot be over certain amounts, right? And also in jail, you cannot receive cruel and unusual punishment from the government, right? The Ninth Amendment ensured the unlisted rights are retained by the people, right? So this is what I talk about in the Ninth Amendment. It's a little weird, but it says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed with any or disparage other retained by the people. Basically saying that, right, unlisted rights that are not listed in the Constitution, they are retained by the people. The people have the right to fight for those rights, right? The last amendment reserved the power to not delegate federal government or to other people, right? Any reserved powers not delegated to federal government belongs to the state or the people, right? So these are our 10 amendments, or not 10 amendments, yeah, these are our Bill of Rights, right? 10 amendments in our Bill of Rights. So next, I'm going to quickly touch on the power of each branch, right? And the breakdown. So this is not in your textbook, but I think as a student studying U.S. history, you should know this. I'm pretty sure Mr. Cantu, if you have him next year, he should be also going over this in your government class with him. But in the legislative branch, right, it's broke down by the House and the Senate, right? In the House, there's 435 members. That's the total amount. I think California have 52, right? Not each state's number based on the population, right? California has the highest because we are the highest population. And then each member is a direct representation of district of their state, right? So like in example in Huntington Park, right? Let's look at Huntington. I cannot spell. Huntington Park District. What district is Huntington Park in, right? So it looks like you are right. This dude named Robert Garcia, right? If you're living HP, that would be your district representative, right? You guys, people who are living in HP, I believe, are district number 42, right? Number 42, that is your district, right? Number 42, I think I live in a different district, so, but yeah. And then the census to determine this member is conducted every 10 years, right? I think a little fun fact, California actually lost a seat in Congress because we declined in population in the last census in 2020, so that was funny. So yeah, in House, you're right. The representative are 2-year terms. Their qualifications are they need to be 25 years old at least, and have 7 or more years of U.S. citizenship, right? In the Senate, there are 100 senators, 2 from each state. It's a set number, right? Each member represents a state. They're there for 6 years, and their qualifications, right, slightly larger, right, than House, 30 years old, and 9 years in U.S. citizenship. And these are the power of Congress, right? So these are all listed in Article 1, Section 8, so I'm not going to go over too much of this. You can just look over this, right? These are pretty straightforward. But please look over this, right? Please look over this so you know, right, what type of power the legislative branch have. So, and then the executive branch, right, is broken into some parts. So you have the president, obviously, right? They're 4 years, right, and they can run up to 2 terms, right? All right, max 2, right? Other than FDR, right? Franklin D. Roosevelt was the only president in U.S. history where he ran for more than 2. But we'll learn about why that is when we come to him. But right, max 2 terms, so 8 years. The qualifications that president need to be born in the U.S., at least 35 years old, and 14 years that live in the U.S., right? So, and they're elected through electoral college. And then the vice president, right? The vice president is selected alongside with the president as their running mate. They also run for 4 years, right? They serve also as the president of the Senate, right? This is another important job they have. The vice president is the president of the Senate. So, and if the president dies, resigns, or is impeached, the vice president takes over the presidency, right? And other are like your cabinet members, elected official, departments, right? Agencies. These are all appointed by the president and enforce their specific laws, right? So stuff like that. And then these are the power of the president. So these are not too much I'm going to go over, right? They're the commander-in-chief. Basically, they have the power to over the U.S. military forces. However, they do not have the power to declare war, but they do have the power to oversee the military forces and use it however they wish, as right. So, and they do make treaties with other nation. It is subject to Senate approval and also appoint ambassador, right? Right. I think funny thing is, I think my girlfriend's stepmom. She works in the U.S. embassy. She works in the U.S. embassy, and currently I think she's in Ghana right now, as like the person right behind, the person right under ambassador. I forgot what the word it is, but yeah, that's pretty interesting fact. And then the president also have authorized the president to appoint federal officials, right, with Senate consent, like judges, right, not like judges, cabinet members, right, key current position. They have the power to veto as well, and they have the power to pardon, right, empowers the president to grant pardons and reprieve for federal offenses, right. President Trump pardoned a decent amount of individuals from the January 6th uprising, right, when he took power in this office in this term. So that was one of the powers the presidents have. They can have the power to pardon, and their duty is that they must enforce the law, right? They also need to give the State of the Union address once a year. That one usually is given in January. So you'll see that, and then law execution. So they need to make sure, right, the veto power, right, the president need to ensure that laws passed by Congress are faithfully executed. So once it's passed, it is president's duty to make sure that the law is being executed, right? And they have the judiciary branch. On the top of the judiciary branch, you have the Supreme Court, right? And these federal judges in the Supreme Court serves for life once they're voted in by the Senate, unless they are impeached for very, very serious misconduct, right? And then the judicial branch breaking down a little weird, right? There's 3 ways it's broken down. First, you have the state Supreme Court, right? The state and the lower state Supreme Court, these are basically the power of the states, right? These are not federal courts anymore. These are state courts, right? So you have the federal state Supreme Court. So for example, California, we have a state Supreme Court, right? And then we have lower states courts, right? Like district courts and stuff like that. So these are taken care of by the states. And then you have other federal courts under the Supreme Court. You have the U.S. Court of Appeal. This is, right, this court in the U.S. Court of Appeal, a case that is appeal from the district court goes to the Court of Appeal, right? So we'll look on the bottom, right? Look on the bottom because it goes upward, right? So in the U.S. District Court, right, this is the lowest federal court, right? It's the U.S. District Court, right? These are trials for federal judiciaries, right? They only hear testimony here, usually in front of a judge or a jury, right? They only hear testimonies. Usually, right, they make a decision. If you want to appeal it, then it goes to the Court of Appeal, right? If you are not happy with the decision, then you need to go to the Court of Appeal, and then the Court of Appeal does not have a jury, right? The Court of Appeal is the only court, or the Supreme Court doesn't either. But the Court of Appeal does not have a jury. Instead, right, you are giving the testimony new evidence, right? And new evidence that you didn't give in the district court, right, is where you give in the U.S. Court of Appeal. And then it's heard by 3 panel judges to determine whether there was a mistake made by the district court or not. And then some other federal courts, right, are like bankruptcy courts, Court of Appeal for Armed Forces, right, Court for Federal Claims, or U.S. Tax Court. These are all specific courts that are focusing on the federal government part, right? So these are courts to only hear crimes made within, right, or mistakes made within the federal government itself, right? So for example, if a soldier commits a act of atrocity during wartime, right, they're usually heard in the U.S. Court of Armed Forces, and there's no jury there, right? It's just, right, the government decide everything in those federal courts, right? And then to go into our Supreme Court, it is the highest court of the U.S. It is known as the last stop, right, for the judicial system, and its decisions are final, right? Usually when it becomes a certain decision, that decision it also becomes law for like the entire country, basically, right? It also has authority over lower federal courts, right, and state courts. The Supreme Court has 9 justices in total, with a chief justice, right? With the chief justice has 9 justices. Justices are appointed by usually, right, they are nominated by the president and then appointed through the Senate approval, right? Once they're appointed, they're there for life unless they're impeached due to some misconduct. However, they're there for life to ensure an independent judiciary, right? That means that no matter what the next president is, right, they cannot fire the justice, right? No matter who's the president, no matter who's in charge of the Congress, right, justice are there for their life, and their salaries cannot be lowered. This protect them from external influence, right? Protect them from people, lowering their salary to, in case, I don't know, so like to threaten them or something, right? Their salary cannot be lower in that case. And then they do a lot, right? They receive about 7,000 petitions every year, but there's only 9 of them, so they only hear about 100 to 450 cases each year. And usually when the ruling, right, they set our precedent, means that their decision usually guides similar cases for all U.S. courts, right? Because they're the Supreme Court of the land. And then the power of judicial review is establishing, this is a little going ahead, but for now, just know that you can also look over the entire slide, right? But note that the power of judicial review is basically saying that it gave the Supreme Court the power to decide whether laws passed, right, by Congress and signed by President, right, whether those laws are constitutional or not, whether those laws are legal or not. And if the Supreme Court thinks it's illegal, they have the power to strike down the said law by the federal government or the state law, right? If that makes sense, okay? And then we'll learn about the origin of judicial review in a future lesson later in this unit, all right? And that's it for today's lesson. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Again, please remember, I'll attach a link here as well for this homework. Please remember to read the homework. I will hold a quick little 15-minute seminar, 15 to 20-minute seminar on Wednesday when I come back about the Constitution. So please be ready for that. Otherwise, have a great day. Thank you for listening.